So, 2016 is gone. Yes, it is gone. It's over with. Some people just don't want it to stay dead. But for me, I have been enjoying the movies of 2016. Now, a lot of people seem to think that 2016 is the worst year in film. But unless you actually go out and watch movies like I do, you would find that there are more good movies than bad movies that happened this year. Like, remember how I had a worst list that was 20? This year, I have 30 good movies. 30. Now, some of these may not be your personal favorites or your personal best, but for me, I find them very, very good. The only problem to this list is that I have to split it in two parts. Yep. So, in case you were wanting to really know what my number one movie of all time for this year is, you will have to wait another week. And unlike many other reviewers who can actually get best lists out in January, this unfortunately has to come out in February due to the fact that I have to catch up to some of these reviewers in terms of the movies they've watched. And while I have disagreed with some of the other critics, contemporary critics, on some movies, this year I pretty much have mostly an agreement with some of these critics. So, without further ado, in this episode, we are going to be counting down from number 30 to number 16. So let's get right into it. Batman Return of the Caped Crusaders is one of those films that is an homage to something that had been really wacky back in the 60s. In fact, this entire movie is an hour-and-a-half long episode of the Batman television series from the 1960s. Hell, it even has a recurring voice cast from Burt Ward and Adam West, who both played Robin and Batman respectively. It is a very fun film, but it is a very guilty pleasure type film. The reason being is that while it is staying true to the roots of what made that version of Batman popular, it's still very, very cheesy in its writing. It is a very guilty pleasure film because it's not very, well, how else am I supposed to explain this? I don't know. I don't know how else am I supposed to explain this to you. Batman Return of the Caped Crusader is just kind of like one of those films that's like, oh yeah, well you remember the 60s, right? This is how wacky it was, in terms of writing, in terms of character style, and that's pretty much it. Nothing much else to go off of for Batman Return of the Caped Crusader. Rogue One, A Star Wars Story, is not very high on this list this year for the reasons that I specified in my review for Star Wars Rogue One. When you're trying to make a war film, especially a film that involves every single character dying in the end of the film, wouldn't you want to have character development so that you could get more attached to these characters? Like, I understand the need to have all of them die in the end and thus not have much character development because we're not going to get attached to them in the first place. But, again, when you're talking about a war film, you need to have character development, some sort of characterization that allows us to connect with these characters, and that's what this film kind of failed at. However, what it does fail at, or what it does succeed at, I should say, is telling a pretty good, convincing story behind the reason why there's an exhaust port on the Death Star, and it's pretty much a companion piece to A New Hope. It's not a great Star Wars film. I wouldn't even say it's a good Star Wars film, but it is very passable. It's very pleasurable in a way. It's very serviceable. And that's all I have to say for Star Wars Rogue One. For once, Illumination actually did something cool. And for me, Sing was one of their best films they've made. Now, I could have put A Secret Life of Pets on this one, But for me, what constitutes a good movie is them not relying on the Minion brand. And in Secret Life of Pets, they had a Minion costume. That's what kind of broke it for me. But with Sing, it felt like a very original idea. It really did. The music pops off the screen, and it's mostly thanks to Garth Jennings, no relation, that it allows it to have such a good musical atmosphere, a good flair. What I also love about this film is that it's very solid. It's very grounded. It doesn't take the story into these fantastical areas where fame is dramatized. No. It takes it on a very level playing field where all the characters are pretty much equal. They're all starting from the ground up. A very grassroots type of group. Now, Buster Moon obviously is not really the best character, as it does kind of enforce embezzlement in a way and pretty much begging people for money. But there is a reason behind that. There's a solid reason behind it. He loves theater, like I love theater. He wants to make his business keep on growing, and I think everyone can relate to that. They want to make their brand successful. That's what this movie was trying to do. Kung Fu Panda 3. Now, Kung Fu Panda 3 is it's a movie that is kind of the Return of the Jedi for this trilogy. Like, you have its fans, but they will always say it's not as good as number 2. And that's what I feel with Kung Fu Panda 3. It definitely takes a huge step in the right direction in terms of animation. The animation is stellar in this film. The colors pop. It's vibrant. It's beautiful. But the story is not as good or complex as the original film. Or as the original film, or even the sequel, which is probably the best of the trilogy. Now, does it have some really nice intrinsic themes from Asian mythology and Asian philosophy? Well, yeah, there is. But it's not as deep or complex as as Kung Fu Panda 2 did. And it's kind of odd for me putting a movie called Kung Fu Panda 3 on a best list. Let that sink in for a moment. A ridiculous title such as Kung Fu Panda 3 getting put on this list. That's how much I kind of like this franchise. DreamWorks does a really good job in the departments of How to Train Your Dragon and Kung Fu Panda. But this is a word to the wise for DreamWorks. I want them to expand a bit more. I want them to be a bit more expansive in terms of writing, in terms of creating original concepts. Now, I admire what they did with the movie Trolls, but it doesn't make this list. It didn't make the worst list either. It's just kind of meh. But Kung Fu Panda 3 definitely is a standout. For the Love of Spock is a documentary that I recently watched on Netflix, and I finally got it on Blu-ray. And it tells the story about how Spock, the character from Star Trek, the original series, has gone on to be such a pop culture icon. Now, of course, during the filming of this documentary, unfortunately, we lost Leonard Nimoy. And it was such a travesty to the fans of the Star Trek community, or even to the pop culture, or even to the world as we know it. This film highlights why we love his character. This is a film that highlights why we like Leonard Nimoy, not only as a director, but as a character actor for this specific character. And that's why Spock will always live long and prosper for all of us Star Trek fans, for all of us pop culture nerds in our hearts. This film fully accentuates why we love it in great detail. I highly recommend you watch this documentary because it is good. Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. Okay, here's why it makes my list. I am a Harry Potter nerd. I like this film. Is it good? No. Is it bad? No. It has its problems, yes. And I will fully acknowledge that it has character writing problems, it has pacing issues, but the thing is that I am still kind of wanting to see where this goes. I acknowledge that this film isn't as strong as everyone wanted to be, but I think that if you allow this film to really push this story arc forward, because again, this is a 1 out of 5 films. Wouldn't you want to hear the full story behind everything before you make a quick judgment as to this happening? That's kind of what I feel with people judging The Force Awakens as if it's a standalone film. It's part of a trilogy. So I would wait until all the movies come out before I make a full flat judgment on the concept of Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. Because this is only 1 of 5 films in this franchise. And I'm kind of anxious to see where this goes. And granted, the first one is kind of like the Sorcerer's Stone in a way. It just kind of establishes the world and everything. It's just an establishment piece. The next one could be actually good with a lot more world building. There is some world building that is new to Harry Potter itself, but we'll see. I want to see where it goes, at least. I do. You can say whatever you want about Fantastic Beasts, but I am kind of excited to see where it goes. This is funny, because at first, when I went in to see this movie, I was expecting this movie to be one of the worst films of 2016, by far, because going off of what I knew from the first Ouija film, I really wasn't going to like this film. But as soon as the opening credits for this film rolled, I was entranced. Granted, it is nothing truly spectacular, but it is a good horror sequel in a way that it expands the lore, it tells a very good story, it doesn't rely on the cheapest of jump scares, and the cinematography for this movie is pretty good for a horror movie. And granted, is it the best horror movie of all time? No. Is it the best horror sequel? Maybe. I mean, you could make the argument that because the first one flopped so hard, that this one comes out and it's like, oh, well, this is going to be really cool. And this is actually a really good one. And in a way, I kind of agree. Ouija 2 definitely deserves to be on my list. Manchester by the Sea. I went to go see this in a very small theater downtown in Eugene, and in a very intimate environment, because there's only 12 seats in each of the theaters, and the screen was like, it wasn't that big, but we could all see it. We could all be entranced by the film. And the film, okay, I'll give it this. It's kind of boring in parts. But if you allow it to tell its story, it's kind of unconventional in a way, but it's a story about depression. It's a story about it's a story about avoidance and the inevitability that we will have to, experience these things again and again and again. We have to confront what we initially were running away from. And that's what I really like about this film. Especially the performance by Casey Affleck, giving kind of an asshole-ish type performance. And at first, for me at least, I was like, am I really wanting to stay through this movie? Because it just seems to me that Casey Affleck is not that enjoyable of a guy. But seeing how this performance was really good, I stand to believe that this was a pretty good movie. Is it the best? Well, obviously not. It's not in my part 2 video. But for what we got, I thought it was pretty good. Split. Now, I know what you're going to say, Internet. Well, Split just came out in theaters, Nick, so why are you putting on 2016's list, huh? Well, I'll tell you why. Split came out at AFI Fest in 2016. That is why I'm putting it in the 2016 list. Even though I just saw it in theaters a couple weeks ago, I find this film to be one of the most promising signs for a director ever. See, what you have to understand about M. Night Shyamalan is that after Unbreakable, he had a huge downgrade in his films. The Village wasn't really that good. Signs wasn't really that good. Avatar: The Last Airbender is essentially his abortion from film. You had After Earth, which was written by Will Smith, and he directed it, and it was terrible. And then you get a film like The Visit, which genuinely pleased some audiences, but once we saw Split and its twist ending, once I saw its twist ending, I really loved it. For me, Split is definitely a return for M. Night Shyamalan at the director's chair. It's a return for M. Night Shyamalan to be a writer, to be a creator of it. Now, there is one slight problem I find with this film that caused this film not to be in my top 15, and that is from certain story elements where I didn't feel that he earned certain story moments. And I'm not going to spoil anything about it because, honestly, the story for that kind of works with the characters within the world, but I just didn't feel that M. Night Shyamalan deserved to write something like it. But Split definitely is a well-written piece. It kept me intrigued throughout the entire piece. James McAvoy gives a hell of a performance that is just as scary as John Goodman in 10 Cloverfield Lane, if not even creepier than that. And that's all I'll say about Split, because Split is definitely worth your time. Edge of 17 is a film that at first I thought was going to be like a generic high school film. I thought it was just going to be kind of a passable, a nostalgic high school piece, but it turned out that it was fun. It was good, and the character writing is like what you would hear from a college student. Or not a college, but a high school student. Sorry, high school student. You know, it's very believable. I've seen so many people in high school, you know, cussing and drinking and all this other stuff. The first 2 acts of this film really, really work. However, if you watch the first 2 acts, you're pretty much going to predict what the 3rd act brings. That's kind of the downside to this movie, but other than that, you get some really good performances, especially from the female lead, and especially from Woody Harrelson, who does a really good job as this mentor teacher, and I honestly, it's one of the most refreshing films I've seen this year. Hail Caesar. Okay, for one thing, I think Hail Caesar is not the best Coen Brothers film. However, there is a lot of historical significance with the film, being that it is based off of what really did happen in the 1950s, where actors would get kidnapped by a certain political party back in the 1950s that had been, witch hunted by the McCarthyism era. But the film's writing is not as strong as I felt it is. Other than that, I did find this film to be funny, the characters are really good, and it's really well paced, I'd say. It's very well paced. Definitely is worth your time. Not the best Coen Brothers film, but it's definitely. Moana is a very beautiful looking animated film, and that's, I shouldn't have to say that Disney films look beautiful now, because it should be common knowledge that most, if not every single animated film from Disney is top-notch animation. It's top-notch, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful-looking film with a very relatable story that we all know and love, where you have a princess who wants to go out and save her people. But granted, she makes fun of that aspect by saying, well, I'm not a princess. And they kind of do these weird sort of fourth wall break jokes that is, like, very self-conscious, and I kind of like that. At least it's having fun with itself. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson gives a very cool performance as Maui. His number in the film is one of the best. The music in this film is some of the greatest. In terms of staying power, it really has nothing much else to say. Aside from it trying to lampoon itself in terms of the style that it's in, it really doesn't have anything sort of deeper than that. Not really. I mean, granted, you could probably make the argument that Pollution is its deeper thing, but honestly, I think it's just enjoyable. It's an enjoyable musical that gets back to its roots in some ways and makes fun of itself in other ways. So, take it what you will, and Moana will ride your waves, I guess. That's all I really have to say for Moana. The Green Room was one of the last films that Anton Yelchin, star of Star Trek, was in. And this is a really dark film. This is a dark, gruesome, bloody film about a punk rock band trying to survive the night, trying to hold out against neo-Nazis. That is led by Patrick Stewart. That is all I have to say about this film. Watch this film. It is very fun, enjoyable, and it's really good. Don't Breathe was one of those films that I felt reinvented some of the tropes and the cliches of sort of heist films as well as survival films. But in some cases, it kind of reverts back to those tropes and stereotypes about horror films. But honestly, it's a very good concept. The cinematography is really well done. The sound design is really good. Stephen Lang gives a really incredible performance as the blind guy in the house that's trying to protect it. And the best comparison I would say that this film is if Macaulay Culkin went to war, lost his sight, became old and curmudgeonly, but to the point where he sets up booby traps inside of his house to protect it from burglars. That right there is a really fun concept. I enjoyed this film. Probably not as much as everyone else, but I thought it was really good. It was a great suspenseful horror film. Not dispensable, it does have some staying power, but it was really good. Is it the best horror film? No. But I found it pretty good. Star Trek Beyond. Star Trek Beyond, it surprised me in so many ways, and it's a very underrated film. Not a lot of people went to go see it, and for an understandable reason. See, what I think happened is that because of the backlash that the J.J. Abrams verse got, because of Into Darkness, staying too close to the original source, staying to the point where it started remaking the Wrath of Khan, people have left off that project. And also the change in director doesn't really help either. But Star Trek Beyond is probably the closest that this new universe is to writing like a episode of Star Trek. You have a planet that's full of people, of aliens, of species that are very unique and diverse in the types of characteristics, mannerisms, and makeup designs that you can get. It was even reportedly told that this movie had 50 different creatures to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the franchise. And I felt that this was a really good way to show that. Simon Pegg does a really good job writing these characters and having these character interactions done in a way that really does remind you of an episode from Star Trek. Now, if it's one thing that I do have to complain about, is that this is the same plot that we've seen twice now, where we have a terrorist who wants to get back at the Federation and goes out to try to destroy the Federation, but the Enterprise comes in to try to save the day. That's it. That's really all that happens in this film. That's the essential plot line, and it's worked for them so far, but it's kind of a... It's not the best. It's kind of the weakest part about this film. So all in all, thank you so much for watching part 1 of my top 30 best list. I will be working on my top 15 best list very soon, and I hope you guys tune in to watch that, because I have been watching so many good movies, and I recently just saw one last night that might be on the top list. Who knows? You'll have to wait and see and find out. So, until next time, I'll see you behind the camera. Peace.